Thank you all so much for joining us today for our webinar. Today's webinar will be presented by Jay Chalk, Ombudsperson of British Columbia, and Jamie Green, Manager of our office's Public Authority Consultation and Training team. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are presenting this webinar to you from our offices on Fort Street in Victoria. We acknowledge with respect that the Office of the Ombudsperson is located on the unceded traditional territory of the Lekwungen people and ancestors, the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. It is with respect and gratitude that we're doing this important work on these lands. I will also note that the work of our office extends across the homelands of many different Indigenous peoples within what we now call British Columbia. As part of this work at our office, we're committed to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and we are continuing to expand how administrative fairness incorporates or should incorporate Indigenous perspectives, laws, and values. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items to note. Just want to note you can change your view of the presentation using the view button at the top right of your screen. You can click that and choose how you would like to view things. During the webinar, there will be opportunities to participate by way of poll questions that we will be putting up on your screen. Furthermore, there'll be 2 Q&A opportunities. You can post your questions by using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please send your questions in throughout the webinar. Jay will answer some of the questions live, and we'll try to respond to as many of the questions as we can during the webinar. We have a large number of people, though, attending today, so if we don't get to your question during the webinar, we'll do our very best to respond directly to you afterwards. You'll note that given the number of participants, the Zoom chat function is turned off for participants. If you have a question, please use the Q&A feature and we will get back to you. We'll be recording the webinar and posting it on our website. Closed captioning is available on Zoom, so there is also a button on the Zoom screen for that. And if you wish to reference the online version of Fairness by Design, it will be posted in the chat now for your convenience. So just a little bit about the agenda for today. First of all, we'll be talking about, Jay and Jamie will be discussing why you should use the guide and who should use it. Next, we'll be talking about the 7 fairness standards. That will be followed by a discussion of how and when to use the guide and checklist. And finally, we'll be talking about how you can implement the fairness standards in your organization. I'm going to now turn it over to Jay, who will talk about why organizations should complete a fairness self-assessment. Thanks so much.
Good morning. I'm Jay Chalk, Ombudsperson of British Columbia. Welcome, and thank you very much for registering for today's webinar. I was happy to see over 500 registrants for this webinar from across British Columbia and a wide variety of public organizations. We have participants from local governments, the K-12 and post-secondary education sectors, crown corporations, professional regulators, health authorities, provincial government ministries, and more. So we're here today to talk about an updated guide recently released by my office called Fairness by Design, an administrative fairness self-assessment guide. The original Fairness by Design guide was released in 2019 by the Canadian Council of Parliamentary Ombudsmen, of which our office is a part. The council decided to update and expand upon the original guide, and we released this new guide in December 2022. The goal of this guide is to empower public bodies by giving you a self-help tool to look at the fairness of your own practices and identify gaps and opportunities for improvement. Through this webinar, we want to provide some guidance on how and when to use the guide and talk about how the guide can be useful for you in your own role and also for your organization. Before we talk more specifically about Fairness by Design, I want to provide a brief overview of the role of my office as an independent office of the legislature. My office receives and impartially investigates complaints from the public about fairness when dealing with government and other public bodies. We then seek to resolve any fairness issues that we identify. Broadly speaking, our role is to be BC's independent voice for fairness and accountability. We do this by hearing the fairness concerns people bring to us and addressing the problems that we find. Broadly, we ensure fair treatment by public authorities. We receive over 8,000 complaints and inquiries a year from people across the province. We also support public authorities to improve public administration by proactively building fairness into their programs and services. This webinar is an example of this work. While today's webinar is focused on fair public administration, which is the foundation of the Ombudsperson Act, my office also has responsibilities under British Columbia's new Public Interest Disclosure Act. This is BC's whistleblower legislation. A phased approach has been taken to bringing public sector authorities under the Act. It currently applies to current and former staff in government ministries, independent offices of the legislature, Crown corporations, BC's tribunals, and a number of agency boards and commissions. Additional public authorities will come under the Act over the next 2 years. This Act allows current and former employees to which the Act applies to safely disclose wrongdoing and share otherwise confidential information when they follow a specific process. It also provides individuals who disclose wrongdoing with protection from reprisal. So if you're interested in learning more about BC's new whistleblower law, please visit our website or reach out to my office directly. I'd like to take a moment here to acknowledge the responsibility that we all have as public service providers to be fair in the work that we do. And this includes proactively taking steps to build fairness directly into the design of our organization's programs. I certainly recognize there are so many demands upon the working time that we all have. And through my office's investigations, we see many examples of organizations delivering their services effectively and fairly. But there's always opportunities to improve as well. Organizations know their own program best, and so we see the Fairness by Design Guide as an opportunity for organizations to build fairness in from the start, and also to recognize issues of unfairness themselves and fix them. So this is where Fairness by Design can be very helpful. The standards in this guide cover all aspects of fairness that your organization should have in place. We all assume that we're being fair, but until we take the time to be focused and disciplined in assessing fairness in our organizations, it's very easy to let fairness standards slide. The guide sets out at a high level what you need to do to be fair. You can use it to proactively conduct a systematic review of the fairness of the programs and decision-making processes in your organization. It gives you a chance to ask internally, are we doing the things we need to do to be fair every time? And are we measuring up to the fairness standards? This will then allow you to identify and address problems before they become the subject of a complaint, either to you or to us. By doing such a review, this supports effective and fair service delivery and decision-making by your organization. And it also demonstrates accountability on the part of your organization and a commitment to be fair. We also think it's good for staff morale because your staff will have confidence that they're treating the public fairly. So these are some of the good and practical reasons why we think it's useful for you to undertake a fairness self-assessment. Next, just to turn to the question of who should use this guide. We want to emphasize that it isn't just for senior leaders. Fairness by Design can be a useful tool for everyone in your organization. We think staff at all levels can benefit from using the guide to self-assess fairness in the context of their own work. This applies to those individual staff responsible for delivering services on the front lines fairly, and also to policy staff who are responsible for developing fair programs and policies. But it also applies to senior leaders who may be operating from a vantage point that allows them to see some of the emerging issues that may not yet be apparent to everyone in the organization. Simply put, the guide is for everyone. I'm now going to turn it over to Jamie to introduce the fairness standards found in Fairness by Design. Jamie?
Great. Thank you, Jay, and welcome everyone. My name is Jamie Green, and I'm the manager of our office's Public Authority Consultation and Training team, and I'm really happy to be here today to talk to you about this guide. So I'm going to introduce and review the 7 fairness standards that you can find by reading the guide. Now, we developed these 7 standards based around our office's fairness triangle that we use as a simple and straightforward tool to explain the different aspects of administrative fairness. So the triangle breaks down administrative fairness as follows. On the first side, we have fair process. So this is focused on whether a fair decision-making process is followed when decisions are made that directly impact people. On the second side of the triangle, we have fair decision. So this looks at whether the decision itself is fair. So this includes looking at whether the rules that apply were followed. And finally, on the third side of the fairness triangle, we have fair service. And this simply looks at whether people are treated fairly by a public organization. So just to get everyone here today, thinking a little bit about administrative fairness at your individual organizations, we're going to go ahead and put a poll up now and ask you to participate by putting an answer in. Now, these polls are totally anonymous. And so what the poll asks is, what aspect of the fairness triangle do you feel that your organization does well? So is it the process side, the decision side, the service side, or perhaps it's, all 3 sides? So just a way to get yourself thinking about, hey, how do we do fairness at our organization? Give everyone a moment. We've got a lot of attendees today, so I just want to give you a few moments here to share your answers. A lot of answers coming in. Great. Thanks, everyone. Okay, great. All right, I think we will share those answers out now. So a lot of folks are saying that all 3 sides of the triangle, you do well at your organization. And then a number of folks are saying, all the other sides as well. So that's great to see that when you reflect on your organization's work, that you see all 3 sides of this triangle being done well. Because we definitely see, all 3 aspects of the triangle as being important for fairness. So I'm going to move on now and actually introduce the standards that you will find in the guide. So you will see when you read the guide that each standard is introduced. And then the focus of the guide is on setting out what needs to be done in practice to meet the standard. So I'm going to start by introducing the fair process standards. They're the first 2 standards in the guide. And the first fairness standard is participation and being heard. So meeting this standard is really about ensuring that when a decision is being made that directly impacts a person or a group, that they have an opportunity to meaningfully participate and be heard by the decision maker in that decision-making process. So this includes receiving notice of the decision that's being made and also information about the decision-making process and rules that will be followed when making the decision. So the decision-making criteria. And it also includes at the end of the decision-making process, receiving understandable reasons for the decision made. And so that's the first standard. Now I'm going to go ahead and talk about the second standard. So the second fairness standard is impartiality and integrity. Meeting this standard requires that decision makers be impartial and unbiased when they're making a decision that directly impacts a person or a group. And more generally, it requires that staff act ethically and with integrity when carrying out their duties on behalf of your organization. So as I'm introducing these standards, you may wonder, why do these fairness standards matter in the context of the work of my own work or my organization's work? And why should we make sure that we meet them? So when you look in the guide, we've answered this question actually individually for each standard. So I want to just refer you to the guide in terms of looking at, why do these individual standards matter? And now I'm going to move on and talk about the next 3 fairness standards. And these all fall on the decision side of the fairness triangle. So the third fairness standard is the requirement that your organization have lawful and fair rules. So to meet this standard, the rules that your organization works under and uses to make decisions must follow the legislation that governs your organization's work. So essentially, you must follow the law. Additionally, the rules your organization uses must be fair. And this is really because fair rules are necessary in order to make fair decisions, and to deliver fair outcomes. And now I'm going to introduce the fourth fairness standard, which is reasoned decisions. And this was a new standard that we introduced in this version of the guide. This standard requires that your organization staff are well supported to make informed and well-reasoned decisions. So this includes ensuring that decisions made are consistent with the rules that apply, and also that they're based on the individual circumstances of the matter being decided. And the final or the fifth standard on this, and that falls on this side of the triangle, is equity. So you will see in the guide that being equitable means taking steps to ensure that your organization's programs and services do not treat people unfavorably or lead to lesser outcomes because of someone's personal characteristics. So things like people's age, their race, their income, and other personal characteristics should not lead to lesser service or outcomes from your organization. We're going to move now to talk about the final side of the fairness triangle, which is fair service, and the last two fairness standards. And so the sixth fairness standard is accessibility and responsiveness. So what this is really about is making sure that your organization and its programs and decision-making processes are accessible and responsive to the diversity of people and communities that you serve. And the guide, of course, we think, has some good ideas in this regard on how to do this in practice. And one of the ideas that it shares is that in terms of accessibility, part of accessibility is ensuring that you collaborate with Indigenous leaders and communities to ensure that your organization is accessible to the Indigenous communities that you serve. So the final and seventh fairness standard is accountability. So this is really about ensuring that your organization is accountable to the public and particularly to those who use your organization's services. So meeting this standard requires that your organization have a robust and accessible complaint process, and that more broadly, there's a culture of continuous improvement at your organization. So what does this include? It includes working to improve and fix things that are unfair or that aren't working well. And you will see in the guide when you read it, that in the guide, we refer to our office's complaint handling guide. So that's another guide that your organization can use if you are working to develop or revise your complaint process. So I just want to move on now to kind of show you all the 7 standards on one slide together here, and just say that we think that these 7 fairness standards will support you and your organization to ensure that you are being fair and delivering services fairly to the public. And so for the rest of the webinar, we really want to focus on the ways in which you can use the guide practically and effectively within your organization. But first, just to get everyone back involved in the presentation, we want to do another poll. And we just want you to reflect on those 7 fairness standards that we just introduced. And the question we want to ask is, what fairness standards are most important in the work you do? And you can actually choose all 7 of them or just a few. So you can choose 1 to 7 of these when you think about, hey, what is really important in the work we do? Certainly, it will really depend on what organization you're at, because in each of our organizations, we have different things that matter more or less to ensuring fairness. Lots of answers coming in, and thanks everyone so much for your great participation. Just give it a few more moments here for everyone to share. Hundreds of responses coming in, so this is great. All right, I think we'll go ahead and we'll share those answers out. So the top 2 answers that people shared are impartiality and integrity and reasoned decisions. But almost all of the different standards got received a lot of responses. So really, it is true that that all of these things do matter. So thank you everyone for sharing your responses to that. I'm now going to turn things over to Jay, who's going to share an example of what it can look like when these standards are not met.
Great, thanks, Jamie. As Jamie says, I want to share an example of what unfairness can look like, which highlights a couple of the fairness standards that Jamie just introduced. This case summary comes from one of our recent annual reports. And just to say, all our annual reports are available on our website. So if you're interested in looking at 50 or 60 case summaries from every year of our work, they're available there. So in this case, our office investigated a complaint from a person we're calling Mateo. So what happened here? Well, Mateo contacted our office with a number of concerns about the residential tenancy branch. Among them, he explained that he was having issues because English was not his first language. Following a dispute with his landlord, Mateo had requested an in-person hearing with the RTB because he had challenges understanding conversations in English over the phone. Mateo was told, however, that in-person hearings were only conducted for individuals with medical exemptions. Our investigation revealed that there was a publicly available policy that did allow for in-person hearing formats where language may be a barrier, but there was also an internal RTB policy that contradicted this. So this inconsistency raised fairness questions for us. We were concerned about the accessibility of in-person hearings for those who needed them. So we proposed that the RTB create a specific form for hearing participants who needed to request a hearing in another format. And we asked the RTB to modify its internal policy to align with the form as well as with its external policy. And I'm pleased to say that the RTB agreed. This case speaks to fairness standard number 1, which includes ensuring people are heard when decisions are made that impact them, as well as standard 6 about ensuring the accessibility of public programs. And it shows what can happen if these fairness standards are not built into program and policy design. Back over to you now, Jamie.
Great, thanks, Jay. I'm going to highlight quickly here some of the challenges that can arise when these fairness standards that I just introduced are not met. So in Mateo's case that Jay just talked about, it led to concerns about the fairness of the decision-making process because it seemed Mateo may not be afforded a chance to meaningfully participate in the decision-making process around his tenancy. So a pretty important decision. And in our work, we also see other examples where not meeting these standards can lead to unfair decisions being made and where it can lead to service delivery challenges or unfairness in service delivery. And when these fairness standards are not met, it also leads to complaints to your organization and to our office. And it can negatively impact staff morale and the public's perception of your organization. And in some cases, it can also lead to negative media attention and concerns around legal liability or legal proceedings being initiated. So there really can be a lot of pitfalls that arise when these fairness standards are not met. And that is, something that we see at our office and part of what led us to work with our colleagues across the country to develop this guide. All right, I'm going to move on now to provide a chance for everyone out there to ask Jay some questions. We've had a few questions come in, so I'll ask Jay a couple of those now, but feel free to please keep your questions coming and we'll ask Jay a few of these questions now, and then at the end of the webinar, there'll be another chance for Jay to respond to a few questions. So let me just check here. So Jay, the first question that we have is, from an organization asking, what should we do if we complete a fairness self-assessment and we realize actually that there's an unfairness in our process, but it comes from the legislation that we work under?
Wow, well, that's a great question, Jamie, and definitely a challenging challenging situation for any organization to find themselves in. I think first I would encourage people to really critically review the legislation and fully explore the discretion that it gives you to see if within the four corners of the current legislation, you can adopt a fair approach. And if after you do that review, you can, then maybe you make those changes and maybe comply with the legislation, but in a new way. But if after this review you find you still cannot deliver services fairly, I think I would suggest raising the unfairness of the legislation with those decision makers in your organization who are able to raise the matter with those in government responsible for legislative reform. Usually when our office finds unfairness, it's because we've looked into how a law is being administered, but the Ombudsperson Act recognizes that unfairness can arise from a common law rule or a statutory provision itself. So it's always good to raise that with those responsible for the statute, because it could end up being the subject of an ombudsperson investigation and maybe even an ombudsperson report. So great question. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Jay. We're going to actually just have time for that one question now and do a few more questions at the end of the webinar as well. So thanks for that answer, Jay. And I'm going to move on now and deliver a little bit more content here around how can we practically and how can you practically use the Fairness by Design Guide at your organization. So our aim with Fairness by Design really, as Jay mentioned earlier, is to empower you and your organization to proactively consider and assess the fairness of your programs and practices. And this includes your policies and your decision-making processes. So in terms of getting started with a fairness self-assessment, we would recommend that you can start small. So a self-assessment does not need to cover your whole organization. We would encourage you to choose one area to look at, to start, and to really go from there. So what will you find when you actually look at this guide? We've got paper copies of it available. It's also available on our website. The guide itself provides an overview of the fairness standards that I have already introduced. And it also provides you that explanation of why each standard matters in ensuring that your organization is being fair. And it also includes some practical examples that explain sort of practically what the fairness standards mean. And newly introduced to this guide, there's also 2 practical tools, resources at the end of the guide that you can use to help you in your fairness self-assessment. And these are a fairness self-assessment checklist and a fairness standards overview one-pager. And these are both at the end of the guide and also available as individual PDF documents. And we put them in the chat there for you now for you to access. And they're actually fillable forms that you can, the checklist is actually a fillable form that you can work through as part of doing your self-assessment. So really, we want to note that the guide sets out broadly what you need to do in order to meet the fairness standards. And you may need to seek out additional resources and guidance to support you to meet these standards. Just one example is if through self-assessment you realize or you determine you need to develop or revise your conflict of interest policy, you're going to want to not only look at the guide, but also seek out any resources or expertise you may need to do to support you in this. So that's just one point we wanted to make. And now we want to do one more poll and just sort of get you reflecting on what's happened at your organization around fairness self-assessments. So have you or has your organization ever completed a fairness self-assessment? That's the question. The answer options are yes, no, or unsure. So just give everyone a moment to answer that question. Great, thanks everyone. All right, we'll go ahead and we'll share those answers back out. So we're seeing that a lot of folks are unsure if this has happened at your organization. So that's an interesting response, and just a few people have done it so far. So I guess that's probably why you're all here today, is because you are interested in doing it. So that's great. So it's a good starting point to be here today to go from here and go ahead and start that fairness self-assessment. I want to move on now and just review quickly in a bit more detail that fairness self-assessment checklist I mentioned. So that's available for you to use to work through the self-assessment process. And it's a really great starting point because it actually mirrors what you'll find in the guide. So you can go through the checklist and then refer to the exact location within the guide where the topic is addressed and thoroughly explained. So the checklist covers each standard and provides one big question that you can ask yourself to consider whether whatever you're reviewing is meeting that fairness standard. So just for example, under fairness standard 5 in the checklist, which is about equity, it asks whether your organization's policies and systems support you to deliver equitable and fair outcomes for the people and communities that you serve. And then you'll see there's a couple more sub-questions, and this all links back to content in the guide. So just want to share that with you to show you how you can practically use it when you're doing the self-assessment. And I also just want to cover the fairness standards overview one-pager. This really covers all the standards quickly. It sets out kind of what the standard is and what practically you need to do to meet that standard. So you'll see, for example, for Fairness Standard 7, which is accountability, it sets out the 4 keys to making sure the standard is being met. So you can really use this organizationally, but also individually. You could have this one pager at your desk as sort of a overview of what are the standards and are we meeting them in this case. So again, these are all available on our website, both of these tools, and they're also available in the back of the guide. All right, I'm going to move on now to talk about when practically we think the guide will be helpful. So first, you can use it when you're reviewing or developing programs, policies, or legislation. So using the checklist in the development or review stage should really highlight key fairness considerations that should be included in the process and help identify any fairness gaps in whatever you've developed so far or are considering developing. Second, you can use it for staff education and self-assessment. So staff can actually do a fairness assessment of their own program area that they work in, but they can also use it to do a self-assessment of the fairness of their own work and their own individual practices. So this guide can also be used as an educational tool for staff at all levels of your organization. So it can be reviewed as a way to learn more about administrative fairness and also which fairness standards should be met when they're delivering public services. Third, you can use this guide as a part of a proactive annual or semi-annual review by your organization. And you may also use it during strategic planning. Because by proactively taking a look at fairness across your organization regularly, this can really highlight areas where there are opportunities to enhance fairness and then provide opportunities to include planning around making these fairness enhancements in your strategic planning process for the coming years. And finally, you can use this guide when something happens in your organization and there's some sort of fairness problem or issue that arises. This might be through a complaint or when you're noticing that a policy or decision-making process seems not to be working well or maybe leading to an unfairness. So there's some kind of practical ways that it can be used. And I'm going to turn it over now to Jay, who's going to share an example of when using fairness by design at the policy development stage could have supported a more fair policy being developed.
Yes, thanks, Jamie. As an example of how the guide can be used at the policy development stage, I want to highlight the case of Nassim. So what happened in this case? Nassim was a student at a college who received a failing final grade in a course that they needed in order to graduate. They believed that the instructor had failed to apply the course evaluation criteria in a reasonable manner, and so they went to the college's appeals committee. The committee upheld the decision of the course instructor, and Nassim didn't understand the basis for the decision, and they were dissatisfied with the appeal process. So they contacted our office, and we investigated. Through our investigation, we learned that the college's appeal policy was pretty straightforward. Individual committee members independently wrote reports of their decision, explaining reasons for that decision, along with a letter grade for the course. However, the college told us that the committee did not then share these reasons for its decision with the student. So while the college's practice was consistent with its own policy, it was a concern to us and raised questions about the fairness of their appeal process. This is because providing reasons for decisions is a basic element of good administration. It's fundamental to administrative fairness because reasons allow a person to understand why a decision was made. Additionally, providing reasons increases the likelihood that the person will accept the decision and feel that they were treated fairly by decision makers. So once we had reviewed Nassim's case, then we had an opportunity to look at it. We consulted with the college, and the college agreed to send Nassim the complete reasons for the committee's decision. The college also agreed to review its policy in order to make its decision-making more transparent. So why are we sharing this example with you today? Because we think that using the checklist and guide may have assisted the college in developing a fair process directly at the outset. Fairness Standards 1 and 4 speak to the importance of having complete, and understandable reasons for decisions, and having an adequate appeal mechanism. So when developing this policy, the guide might have supported the college to ensure that the appeal process provided adequate, well-reasoned decisions. Back over to you, Jamie.
Great, thank you, Jay. I'd like to talk now about ways in which your organization might be able to implement change in order to meet the fairness standards. And obviously, it's going to be unique to your individual context, your individual organization, and how it delivers services to the public and what service it delivers to the public. But here are some ideas. So what you might be doing is you may review existing practices and systems in order to assess whether they're consistent with the fairness standards. It may also include developing or revising policies and procedures to better align with the standards. You might also look at kind of what training and education are we offering to our staff around being administratively fair, and are there changes to that we need to make or improvements? Another thing you might undertake is a project to seek feedback from both the staff of your organization, but also those who use your organization's services on any proposed changes that you might be considering to enhance fairness at your organization. Lastly, for those of you who are responsible at your organization to implement sort of wide-scale organizational changes, one of the steps you might take is to reflect on what fairness means to you and what it means within the context of your individual work on a daily basis. So just really using, implementing the fairness standards within the context of your own individual work. So I'm going to turn it back over now to Jay, and he's going to share an example of some work that our office is doing to implement these fairness standards.
Yes, thanks, Jamie. We have an example of a change we recently made in our own intake and investigation processes that speaks to Fairness Standard 5 about equity. We did our own assessment over the last few years on the equity and accessibility of our complaint process. And we came to the conclusion that our services were not being used by many Indigenous people across the province because of low awareness of the office, issues with trust, and barriers to complaining to us about public bodies. Therefore, as part of our Indigenous Community Services Plan, we created our Pathfinders Initiative, and we hired 4 individuals throughout the province to work as Ombudsperson Pathfinders. And those Ombudsperson Pathfinders are connecting directly with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people and communities to provide information about the Ombudsperson's role and to help guide individuals to find the best way to bring forward their concerns, whether that be to our office or to one of your organizations or some other avenue. And when an Indigenous person wishes to make a complaint to our office about some public body, the Pathfinders are able to connect directly with our team. So we made this change to our complaint process with the aim to deliver more equitable services and outcomes to Indigenous people and communities, and to address more fully Fairness Standard number 5. Back over to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Jay. So I want to touch briefly again on how you can practically get started in using the Fairness by Design guide. So what are some practical steps that you can take? And it's really going to depend on your role within the organization. So if you're here as an elected official or you sit on the board of an organization, one thing you could do is go to your senior leadership staff and ask them to complete a fairness self-assessment and report back on how your organization is doing on the fairness standards found in the guide. Or if you're a senior leader at your organization, you can ask your staff to do the same thing. In addition, if you are in management or a leadership position, you could also put it on the agenda for the strategic planning process. So you can hand the guide over to someone at your organization, perhaps a month or so before you start the strategic planning process. You can ask them to review and report back on what is happening at your organization and whether there are fairness standards that should be worked on as part of the strategic planning process. Another way to get started is to consider whether you are hearing, or sorry, to consider what you are hearing at your own organization about fairness. So this might include considering the trends and complaints that you receive about your services, and also what fairness gaps your staff may have raised. So staff often have the best information about maybe what's not working so well. So this can support you to know what areas to look at and to allow you to focus in on the areas that may need fairness enhancement. So another way you can get started is by encouraging your organization to include this guide as a tool to use in the policy development process. So whenever a policy is being drafted where administrative fairness may be required, you can add reviewing the guide and completing a fairness self-assessment as part of the policy development process. And finally, no matter where you find yourself at your organization, you can encourage the guide's use among staff. This could be reviewing the whole guide or perhaps just a specific section. And maybe teams at staff meetings can go through the checklist and then report back to those in leadership positions about what they find. So there's a number of different ways to get started, and it really does depend on your actual organization and where you find yourself in the organization. But we just wanted to share those kind of some practical ideas of how to get started. So I want to look back now at the 7 fairness standards here on the screen and just note that we really see the guide as just one very useful tool that you can use to enhance fairness at your organization. And you're going to, of course, need other resources as well. Our office has a ton of resources on our website around fairness. And there's there's also lots of other things out there that you may need to seek out, sector-specific resources, legal advice, or the expertise of other professionals. But this guide is really meant to get you started and to give you that opportunity to really assess what your organization is doing well, and also what you might need to improve on. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jay now, and we've had some more questions come in. So we're going to ask Jay a few more questions here, just to give him a chance to make some more comments around the guide. So I'm just going to look at the questions here. I'm going to start with question. Okay, let's start with this question here. I see that the guide speaks about having an adequate complaint process and appeal process. What do we do at our organization if someone has exhausted these processes within our organization, but they're still telling us that we're being unfair, or they still think that we're unfair?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Jamie. I think it's important to, first of all, take a good self-critical look at how you've dealt with the person's concerns. Have they been thoroughly considered and addressed adequately by your organization? You'll presumably want to make sure that the person has received a clear explanation of how your organization has considered their concerns and the reasons for your decision on their appeal or review. If you've taken those steps and you feel like you've exhausted everything that you can do, and the person still feels like they were treated unfairly, in many cases you can refer them to our office. And if you're aren't sure if you should be sending someone to our office, given where they're at, what stage they're at in your process, just give us a call and and we can let you know whether or not a referral to us is appropriate.
Great, thanks, Jay, for that answer. We have a couple more questions here. The first one is there a fairness standard that stands out to the Ombuds office as something public organizations need to pay more attention to? So is there a fairness standard that stands out to you that, public bodies should really be paying attention to?
Thanks. I think, Jamie, I think you mentioned earlier that we've added, and the Canadian Council of Parliamentary Ombuds in this national guide have added reasoned decisions as a new standard. That was certainly something that, on reflection, I think ombuds across Canada thought could receive more attention. So that was one. But I also would, certainly note that equity is becoming a more evident question of fairness. Questions of fairness arise most very frequently these days in the context of equity. So I think equity would be probably the emerging one going forward.
Great, thanks, Jay. I have another one here too, and the question is, did your office consult with Indigenous people and communities when reviewing the accessibility and uptake of your office's intake and complaint process? And if you did that, how was that done?
Oh, great question. We developed a period of consultation with Indigenous people as we developed something that we're calling our Indigenous Community Services Plan. And it was led by we hired an Indigenous liaison officer to develop that work. It was a bit unusual in the sense that just as we were starting that consultation work, we all of a sudden, like everyone, were impacted by the pandemic. So we had to recalibrate what that consultation would look like, but we ultimately consulted online. I believe it was around 380 Indigenous people in various groupings that we looked at in the context of our services. And we then posted, it's on our website, a report called What We Heard, which was really providing that consultation feedback and being transparent about what we heard in that context. So that all led us to develop phase one of our plan, and we're still working on phase two and looking what else we can do going forward. But it certainly was an unusual way to do the consultation during the pandemic, and probably wasn't our first choice, but the events drove us in that direction, and I'm very pleased to see that we had great turnout and great participation by Indigenous people across the province.
Great. Thank you, Jay. Thank you for answering all those questions. And thanks everyone for sending in your great questions. And we've answered some questions individually as well. I'm going to go on now and just talk a little bit about some of the fairness resources that we have available in our office. They're all on our website. We have a Fairness 101 online course that provides an overview of administrative fairness and teaches participants how to apply the key elements of fairness in their everyday role. It's a really interactive, great course. It takes only about an hour to complete, and it's free and can be done right from your desk at work. So just a great course if you're looking to either refresh or learn more about admin fairness. We also have a number of fairness guides available on our website, including our complaints handling guide, which we already mentioned. And that guide provides practical advice on how to set up a good complaint handling process at your organization. And finally, we have a number of quick tips on our website, which are 1 to 3 page documents that cover various topics of administrative fairness, kind of a quick how-to guides. Some of the topics include bias, how to use discretion fairly, making fair decisions, and how to give a good apology, among other things. We just wanted to point those resources out to you. And we also, I want to just talk a little bit about my team. So my team is here and available to support public bodies across BC to make sure that their work is administratively fair. So how do we do that? We provide training on administrative fairness, and these sessions are focused on introducing the key aspects of administrative fairness, and they can be actually tailored to your individual organization. And we're also here to consult with you. So if you're working to develop a program or a policy, or to revise a program or policy, you want to make sure that it's fair, or talk about administrative fairness with us, we're here and happy to chat. So if you want to reach out to us, we can be reached at our email address there on the screen, which is consult@bcombudsperson.ca. And with that, that's all of our all of our content for today. We will be sending a survey about the webinar, and happy to receive your feedback. And we're happy to talk more about the guide or any questions that you might have. So feel free to reach out to us directly if you do have questions. And thank you everyone so much for taking time out of your day to attend.